In life, in order for something to work, we have very often to build it. But in Moonflight, we have not only to build it, we also then have to deconstruct it in order that it works. Hello, this is Michel Leviathan Sorbet and this is a new episode of Wojennik TV. In most deck building games, your objective will be very simple. You will build your deck, you will add powerful cards to your very often weak starting cards, and at the end of the game you will count the number of points which are either in your deck or in your tableau. But in Moonflight, the game that I will be showing to you today, there is one small twist. Firstly, you will construct your deck, which is pretty similar to other games. But then you will try to unbuild it, you will try to deconstruct your deck in order to stay only with a bunch of cards at the game's end, and only those cards which will be in your hand when the end of the game is triggered will give you points. So this is a different approach to deck building, because deck building is half of the game. The second part is unbuilding your deck, which is a very interesting, very new approach to deck building. The game was published by Kent Games and it was preceded by a successful Kickstarter campaign. The campaign had for its objective to gather £8,000. At the end, the campaign closed with £14,000 and with 400 backers. The author of this game is Glenn Ford. It is a title for 1 to 4 players, but here I'd like just to underline that I will be showing you only the rules governing 2 to 4 player games. This is a game which works solo, but I will be showing how it works and how it plays solitaire in a different review. The minimum age of the player is 12 years and the time of play will be from 30 to 90 minutes. It depends on the number of players. This is a game in which you will incarnate one of the 4 jacks, which are the rulers of the mystical town of Moonflight. You will compete with the other jacks in order to construct your best deck, then to unbuild it and to score the maximum number of points. So now I'd like to show you how the game looks, then I'd like to briefly explain how it works, and at the end, as usually, I'll give you my final thoughts and my final recommendation. So let's begin and let's take a look at Moonflight. Here is Moonflight, prepared to play a 2 players game. In Moonflight, your main objective will be to construct your own deck, to build it, but then during the second part of the game to unbuild it and to score a maximum possible number of points only with the cards that you will be holding in your hand when the end of the game takes place. So this is a different approach from many deck building games in which you build your deck through the entire game and then you score the entirety of your deck. Here it's a different approach. Now, when preparing the game, each player will receive his or her own jack card. We have 4 distinctive jacks. Each of them has their own unique capacity, both on the upper part and on the bottom part of the card, because as you can see, each card in the game can be used in 2 ways. During the first part of the game, before the so-called turn happens, we will be using the upper part of the card with the black font. But when the turn occurs, all the cards in the game, including those that we have in our hand and also our character cards, will be turned, and up from then we'll be using only the
bottom card, now the upper card of the card with the white font. And those two parts will differ in most cases and will grant you different abilities. So each player will receive his or her own jack card, which will also indicate the type of cards or the special deck that you will be using, because we have 4 different decks in the game, each with different cards, each working in a different way, and each requiring a different approach when playing Moonlight. So each player will receive his big deck of cards with the corresponding symbol, as you can see. And from this deck, which is shuffled, which is randomly prepared, each player draws 3 cards and places them in front of him. And those cards constitute his market cards, his market stacks. Apart from that, each player takes also 10 starting cards. Among them, we will find 7 one money cards, so enabling us to receive 1 coin, and 3 totally, or maybe not totally, but rather useless waste cards, which are blank, as you can see. Their main purpose is to take place in our deck and to hinder our development, although some decks, some cards enable us to use those cards also to some benefits. Now, the game also, at the start of the game also, we receive a certain amount of coins, 5 to be precise, but during the game we can gain overs and we have a reserve of coins, both 10s, 5s as 1s. A special type of cards are also the universal market cards. We have 5 of them. We have cards granting us points, granting us additional coins, or maybe also enabling us to draw cards. So this is the universal market from which all players can take cards. So as you can see, each player has their own market. Each player has their own deck, their own set of cards in their hand, a certain amount of coins, and all players will share the reserve of coins and the common market. This doesn't mean that we cannot buy cards which are in opponents' markets, but I'll come to this in a few moments. Now, during the game, as I said a few moments ago, our main objective will be to construct a deck and then to unbuild it and to gain points. Each card has its own value, which tells us what is the cost of putting such a card inside our deck. So we have to spend coins from our reserve in order to buy those cards, paying the price indicated. All the cards have also 2 digits on the upper right part or on the left bottom part, because I remind you that when the turn occurs, those cards will be turned, and those indicate firstly the stability number, which tells us how long such a card can stay in the playing area, or how many cards can be attached to it during each turn. And secondly, what is the value of such a card if it remains in our hand at the end of the game. So as you can see, Rise Up will be worth absolutely nothing. It will grant us 0 points if it happens to be in our hand at the game's end. But for instance, if we have Take Us With You in our hand at the end of the game, we will receive 2 points for it. So as you can see, if this card remains in our hand at the end of the game before the turn happens, because it is also possible to trigger the end of the game before the turn, this card will give us 0 points. But if we happen to have it after the turn, this card will be worth 2 points. So having that in mind, how a turn of Moonflight looks like. Each player has the possibility to act during his or her turn and to do one of several things. After doing his action, it's up to our opponent and then up to another player, and then the turn returns to us and we again have the opportunity to act. If all players successfully pass, the turn ends and we pass to the reset phase. But before this happens, we can play our turns. And during our turns, we have several options. Firstly, during our action, we can play one card from our hand to play. So we can choose one of our cards and place it in our playing area, in our tableau, and obtain the benefits indicated on such a card. So for instance, money will grant us 1 coin, which we will instantly take from the reserve and add it to our reserve. Secondly, apart from playing a card, we can also use the action which is to spend a card. Some actions, some cards in play have the spend keyword, and if they are in our playing area, we can use the spend action in order to activate it. So in order, for instance, to acquire coins when discarding cards. Spending means taking cards from our hand and discarding them, putting them into the discard pile. Thirdly, we can also use the shop action, which is the pretty much most important action in the entire game, because it allows us to acquire new cards. And here again we have several options. Firstly, we can always buy 1 card coming from the common market, paying the price indicated on the card and putting the card onto our discard pile. Secondly, we can buy any number of cards coming from our own market stacks, which share the same symbol as our jack has. So we can, for instance, buy 2 cards from different market rows, but we can also buy a card from one market row and then instantly buy the card which was directly beneath, because those cards will be, those market rows will be sometimes will sometimes have stacks of cards, because those cards will be put onto those stacks during the reset phase. So we can buy any number of those cards. We can also decide to buy a card coming from another player's market row. But this is possible only if we have already acquired another card from another source using the shop action. So we cannot buy a card as our first shop action from another player. This is a rule that protects in some way over players' markets, especially the most powerful cards, which are crucial cards in order to score points at the game's end, or which are crucial in terms of how a deck works, because without some cards, some decks will be just dead. Finally, we have also an action which enables us to build. This is the one and only action among all the others, which can be done only once during our entire turn. Building a card means to place a card face down onto one of our cards which is already in play, which has a stability number bigger than 0. If we place such a card, we protect the card which is being placed in play, because during the reset phase, each card within our tableau will be discarded. But cards which have cards built upon them will stay in the game, because we will, instead of those cards, discard the cards which were built. So this is a way to keep cards in our tableau from turn to turn, because some of them grant us continuous abilities as long as they remain in play. Finally, we can also pass, and if all players successfully pass, the turn ends, and we pass to the reset phase. Now, during the reset phase, we do several things. Firstly, we discard cards from our tableau, apart from the cards which have cards settled on them. Secondly, we also discard coins. We cannot have more than 5 coins at the end of our turn. So if we have more, we have to discard over coins up until the moment we have only 5 of them. Finally, we have also to move all cards from our hand to the discard stack, and we can keep only 1 card. Some capacities enable us to hold more cards, to retain more cards, but normally this limit will be only 1 card which we can permanently retain in our hand. Then we draw cards to replenish our hands. And if at least 1 market row is empty, if at least 1 market stack is empty, we put new cards. But those cards are not only put onto empty spaces, they are put onto each and every stack in the game. So they will be placed not only on our stacks, but they will be placed also to stacks of our opponents. So from each supply stack, we will place a card to each stack in the game. Then we move also we may move one card from our hand to each market stack of a matching suit. So we can decide to put one of our cards which has the same suit as the cards in the market in order to protect it, because this is another mechanics which helps players to protect their crucial cards in order to forbid other players from buying those cards which are extremely powerful and extremely useful in terms of our own strategy. Now, what is important is also that when we replenish the markets, if one of the players has his market stack empty, the turn happens. So as I said a few moments ago, when this occurs, each and every card in play, so each stack, each character card, all cards in our hand will be turned over, and from that moment we will be only using the new part with the white font. And the part now becoming the bottom part with the black font will not be used up until the game's end. So this is an important moment also because it changes how certain cards work. It is also an indicator that the second part of the game starts, and this is the moment when we should definitely think about how to unbuild our deck in order to prepare for the game's end. The game ends at the moment when one of the players has his draw deck and his discard pile empty. If this occurs at that point, because this is the only moment when it can happen during the reset phase, it doesn't happen if this situation occurs during another part of the round, the end happens. And at that moment, the game immediately stops and each player checks the cards that they have in their hand and they verify the number of points that they currently hold. It's the player who has the biggest number of points who wins the game. In case of a tie, it's the player who has the least cards in their draw or their discard pile. Finally, if it's still tied, it's the first player who wins the game. So the game has two different distinctive parts. We have firstly the part where we will be building the deck. Finally, when you will be unbuilding your deck in order to prepare for the end, where only the cards in your hand are the ones that should grant you points. So even if you have high scoring cards in your tableau, somewhere at the top of your deck, that doesn't matter. You do not receive absolutely any points for them. It's only what you have in your hand that matters. And that's pretty it when it comes to the multiplayer rules of Moonflight. Now, I'd like to invite you to my final thoughts, and I'd like to share with you what I like in this game and what I think are also the weaker points of this title.
Deck building games are not something uncanny, are not something rare. We have several games in which we will be constructing our own deck, in which we will be building our own tableau, and in which we will finally count the points in accordance to what we have in our decks and in our tableau, in our hand, etc. But Moonflight is a different kind of animal, because here not only you will have to construct a deck which will be the most efficient deck, but then you will have to deconstruct it, and at the end you will score only the cards which are in your hand. So this is a game which has two very interesting twists, which makes it quite unique. The first one is, as I said earlier, a different approach to deck building, because in most deck building games you will be just trying to grab a certain amount of cards which will grant you points at the game's end. And up to some point you will just try to fuel enough you will try to gather enough cards in order to have an efficient deck. and then to grab those high-scoring cards. In Moonflight, this is only part of the equation, because if the game had only this would be a game like many others. But fortunately, we have those two twists. And the first one is related to the way how the points are attributed at the game's end. At the end, it's only what you hold in your hand that will matter. So you absolutely have to not only construct a very efficient deck which will enable you to gather new assets during the first part of the game, you have also to plan ahead in order to see how to deconstruct your deck, how to fin it, and to end the game in your hand only with the high scoring cards. This is not a very easy task, because you have really lots of cards in your deck and you have to carefully plan ahead. You have to know what tools to use in order to get rid of all those non-scoring cards. Because if you don't and the end game is triggered, you can end the game with 0 points, because if you happen to have, for instance, 20 cards in your deck when the end of the game is triggered, and among those cards you have only 4 or 5 scoring cards, it's very probable that at the end of the game you will have 0 points. So it's something of a race, because it's the most efficient deck, it's the most efficient Jack who will be the best one, who will have the bigger number of points at the game's end. Although I have seen situations, I have experienced such games in which I triggered the end game thinking that I have the best tools, and because I have only 5 cards left in my entire deck, discard and hand, those are scoring cards, but still my opponent won. I played a game in which I had some 7 or 8 points and my opponent had still some 10 or 11 cards in his whole reserve, and still he won because he just happened to draw the high scoring cards. So this is not always a winning situation. So you have always to keep it. You have to always keep in mind the fact that triggering the end game doesn't give you the certitude of becoming the victor of the game. The second twist in Moonflight is the fact that if you construct the deck, you have also to take a closer look at what are the bottom parts of the cards which will be used when the turn is triggered. Because in fact in Moonflight you get not only one set of cards, you get 2 sets of cards. Each card has a double action. Firstly, you'll use only the ones with the black font, but when the turn happens, you will turn each and every card in the game and you will be playing with the bottom, now upper part, with the white font. This makes Moonflight quite unique, because when building your deck, again, you have to take into consideration how efficient it will be when the turn is triggered. So concentrating only on the black text, only on the upper part of the cards, is not the best idea. You have always to think how you will use all those assets in your deck when the turn is triggered, because it totally changes the way how the game is played. Even if you play a few turns and get quite used to how you use your deck, at some point you'll have to totally change your strategy, you'll have to totally change the way how you play those cards. And I love those 2 mechanics, they are extremely interesting. I think that they too make this game very unique. When searching for strong points of Moonflight, apart those 2 mechanical aspects, I'd say that the style of the game, this tarotish style with big cards, with this interesting and quite unique artwork, is also something which might be very appealing to some of the players. Especially if you like tarot, if you like this style of tarot cards, Moonflight might be very interesting and it might be something that you can like. What I extremely like in Moonflight is also the fact that we receive 4 very different decks, and all of the 4 jacks which we can incarnate in the game have very different assets. all those 4 decks work totally differently, so playing each of them will be a very different gaming experience. One of them will, for instance, concentrate on heavily card draw and then on trashing tons of cards. Another one will be totally, will have absolutely no asset in his deck allowing him to trash cards, but instead he will build a lot of things. He will stack cards in order to get rid of them. So as you can see, all those jacks work very differently, so playing with each of them will be a different experience. Finally, what I like in Moonflight is the fact that, in contrast to other games, you can keep some money and you can spend it during other turns. Because in many games you can spend only what you acquire during the present turn on the cards that you draw. For instance, in Dominion or in legendary encounters, you draw a hand of cards and you make the best of it using only what you have on those cards. So for instance, in Dominion, if you draw one copper, you won't be able to do anything with it. You do not have any reserve that you can use. So sometimes when playing those games, you'll have empty turns. You'll do absolutely nothing. You'll just draw this card and that's it. In Moonflight, you'll always be able to do something. This is due to the fact that you can always use your cards, but secondly, you'll probably at most times have also some coins to spend. Of course, you have to discard up to 5 coins at the end of each turn, but still, at most times you'll have some coins that you can spend, which is extremely important in the first part of the game. During the second one, coins will be a hindrance. They won't help you at all. You'll try to get rid of them, although sometimes you will acquire one or few additional cards in order to speed up creating the best setting for the game's end. So what, in my opinion, are the weaker points of Moonflight? Firstly, I said that this tarotish style might be appealing for some players, but for others, they may find it bizarre, too dark, or too or without a sufficient number of colors. I personally find the setting quite bizarre because although the idea of becoming a leader of the mystical city of Moonflight seems interesting, when playing the games I didn't have this additional background feeling. I just played a card game. I tried to be the most efficient player at the table. I didn't have the feeling that I am one of the rulers of Moonflight. So the story behind the game is, in my opinion, a story too abstract, too bizarre to be appealing to some players. As I said earlier, it's maybe a question of personal, it may be a personal question, but in my opinion, my personal feelings were that I didn't have this additional theme in the game. I played just a card game, of course using some interesting artwork with big and well presented cards, but still without the feeling that I am a rival of other jacks trying to be the most successful, most prestigious leader in Moonflight. At the end, what am I comparing? I'm comparing points, and they are granted for some cards. But what is the background here? What is the theme? How do those jacks compare their points at the game's end? And if they compare points, how does it cope with the theme of being a representative, a leader of Moonflight? Well, I think it's something which might have been different, might have been more attractive in the way that it is. It is interesting, it is intriguing, but I didn't have this feeling of playing an interesting experience in terms of theme. I had an interesting card gameplay, but not this additional climatic addition which I would like to have, with this depth that I would like to have in each game. Secondly, the rulebook, in my opinion, is a rulebook with some issues. Firstly, you have some very important rules which aren't sufficiently underlined. For instance, the rule which tells you that when the market rows are are resupplied, you can play cards onto those market rows in order to protect your cards. We have one or two phrases, we have an example somewhere, but still, when playing the game for the first time, I've totally forgot this rule because it isn't sufficiently underlined. The text is only black. We have some spaces where we have some examples, but those examples are without any cards, and because the names of the cards are so complicated, those examples didn't help me. Well, some of them did, but most of them would be extremely good if they had some graphical examples, because searching for a specific card in order to recreate the example is just not the thing, it's not the way how we should do it. There should be a representation of those cards, a graphic showing you exactly how those cards look, what is their card effect. That would work better. Thirdly, I think that the game has really two tempos, because in the first part of the game we have some interaction between players. Players will try sometimes to outsmart their opponents by playing some actions in order to delay their crucial decisions. Sometimes they will buy cards from opponents' rows. But in the second part of the game, when all players will be totally focused on deconstructing the decks, this interaction will be very, very limited. Because in fact, the only thing that will matter will be who will manage to deconstruct his deck the fastest. And you will be only verifying how many cards your opponent has. The interaction between players will be extremely limited, and the playing experience will be something like a solitaire game. So we have two tempos, and that might not suit everyone, because in a game for 2 to 4 players, you expect to have a lot of interaction between players, and this will be true only during the first part of the game. In the second, as I said earlier, this will be primarily a solitaire game. Maybe adding some cards which enable you to influence over players' decks, over players' tableau, would be an idea to make people still interested by what their opponents are doing during the turns. For the fourth thing is, in my opinion, the replay value. Now, the replay value is at the start of the game interesting because you have firstly 4 very different decks with very different strategies. So discovering them, learning them will make the game interesting enough to replay it several times. Secondly, you have 2 solitaire modes, but I will be speaking about them during another review, not during this one. So I'm just saying it in order to tell you that the replay value of the game will be increased thanks to their presence in the game. But then, after playing several games with different decks against different jacks, you will find out that at the end, when playing a given deck, your strategy will almost always be totally the same that it was during your previous game. Those decks are strongly focused on one and single one strategy. So you will try to, for instance, draw cards, trash cards. You will try to build cards, stack cards in order to get rid of cards from your hand. There will be no twists, there will be no alternative strategies. Even if you try to buy some cards from your opponent's reserve. But again, if you have a very good machine which is created to give you the most efficient engine in order to grab points at the game's end, why should you bother buying cards from your opponent? Of course, you can do it to hinder your opponent. You can do it to experience, to try to find new strategies. But with the current number of cards and with the current strategies dominating the way how the decks are played, I believe that the replay value will diminish after each game. At the start, it will be quite high, it will be intriguing, it will be interesting, it will be engaging, but then it will become quite boring. So that's fine that we have solitaire modes in the game, because this game will, in my opinion, work very well solitaire, and I will be speaking about it in a different review, as I said earlier. Concluding, Moonflight is an intriguing, interesting game using some very interesting mechanics which make you think differently of deck building games than you did before. A game with a unique artwork, with a unique style, with elegant cards, but at the same time a game with a replay value diminishing after each play, a game which will make you think of solitaire games when played during the second part of the game, and a game with a bizarre setting which might not appeal to every gamer. Even so, even this game is not perfect, I believe it is quite interesting. I enjoyed it a lot, especially during my first plays. If you're looking for a different approach to deck building, Moonflight might be a very interesting experience. This was the review of Moonflight, published by Manokent Games. Thank you a lot for watching this movie. I invite you also to take a look at our other videos. Take also a look at our Facebook and Instagram accounts. If you want to support Wojennik TV, you can also become one of our patrons. You can take a look at our Patronite account. Have a terrific day and see you next time.